Hello and welcome to Shades of Murder. In this podcast, I discuss tales of true crime from around the world and throughout history, discussing its many layers. Please be forewarned that each episode contains specific and at times very graphic and disturbing details of the case and may not be intended for all audiences. Missing and Murdered Indigenous Persons Awareness Day has been an officially recognized national day since 2017 for Indigenous communities, including Native Americans, Alaska Natives, and Native Hawaiians, to remember those they have lost and pay tribute to their memory. Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirits Peoples Day, also known as Redress Day, was established to raise awareness of the ongoing crisis of violence Indigenous girls and women face, in particular in the United States and throughout Canada's First Nation. It is also a day to address how law enforcement and the media continue to neglect tribal communities as their sisters, brothers, and loved ones are stolen from them. Its formal acknowledgement with the designated day indicates that some progress has been made in the areas of legislation, law enforcement, and the media. However, it is merely a tiny step in what must be done to combat this problem. Unfortunately, the steps that have been made up to this point are too little, too late for the countless victims and their loved ones. It is estimated that more than 80% of Indigenous women are the victims of violence, including sexual assault and domestic abuse. Women of Native American and Alaskan Native descent are 10 times more likely to be murdered than women who are not. This statistic should shock everyone and be a wake-up call to raise awareness, support the Indigenous communities by sharing their cases and stories, and not allow any institution to silence their voices. Their disappearances and deaths fail to be prioritized. Their loved ones' concerns are not taken seriously and too often are outright ignored. Issues of historical bias, discrimination, and cultural detachment, in addition to problems of criminal jurisdiction, have led to this epidemic of violence. I present to you a case of a missing and murdered Indigenous woman. It is infuriating, frustrating, and heartbreaking, because justice has yet to be found, as in countless other cases. This is a story of bias, neglect, and the perpetual dismissal of an entire nation of people. It is also told to remember Umonhon tribal member Ashlea Aldridge and her family's endless fight for justice. Macy, Nebraska is a very small and close-knit community, with the 2020 census indicating a population of barely over 1,000 residents. Amongst this town sits the Umonhon reservation, which approximately 3,000 Umonhon tribal members call their home. Ashlea Aldridge was a 29-year-old mother of two small children when she vanished on January 5th, 2020. Her sons meant the world to her, and nothing would have prevented her from being there for them. Something did not sit right with her mother when she never returned home, and she called the police to report that her daughter had gone missing. As we have seen and heard countless times before, law enforcement did not take the concerns of Ashlea's loved ones seriously. Nothing was done to search for Ashlea, so her family took it upon themselves to conduct their own investigation. Ashlea Aldridge, Ashlea's younger sister, helped to lead the search. When Alyssa went to the house where Ashlea's boyfriend lived, she was about to yell for her sister outside the door, knowing that if she heard her, she would understand that she was there to save her from further harm. But something inside Alyssa told her to drive past the house instead. She came upon an open field where she saw Ashlea's boyfriend's truck parked nearby. Battling the snow-covered fields, Alyssa drove up as close to his truck as possible. Her vehicle, though, became stuck in the field, so she had no choice but to explore the area on foot. When she arrived at his truck and looked inside, she expected to see her sister curled up on the seat, but Ashlea was not there. Again, something within Alyssa spoke to her, and she felt a pull, which now directed her to walk towards the creek. Lying near the water's edge near a bridge was her sister Ashlea. Despite the freezing temperatures outside, Ashlea was completely nude, and her body was partially coated in mud. Alyssa knelt over her sister's body, shocked and heartbroken, and held her. Removing her coat, she covered up Ashlea's naked dead body and lay with her sister, screaming for help in the cold winter wind. When the FBI arrived on the scene, it was quickly processed, and Ashlea's body was transferred to the coroners to perform an autopsy. Law enforcement stated that Ashlea Aldridge wandered off in the middle of the night, was intoxicated, collapsed in the field, and died overnight in the freezing temperatures. FBI agents stated that there was no evidence of an assault, much less any indication that she had been murdered. The official autopsy declared that Ashlea Aldridge's death was an accident caused by hypothermia and acute alcohol toxicity. Her family knew that was a lie and pointed out her back and legs were covered in mud. Her father, Galen Aldridge, when he identified his daughter's body at the morgue, noticed that Ashlea had a black eye, her nose was swollen, and she had visible welts all over her body. But law enforcement officially denied either of these to be true. They claimed that there were no signs of foul play and insisted that her death was nothing more than a tragic accident. Allegedly, one particular FBI agent told Ashlea's father, Galen, that there was no evidence of a physical assault before his daughter's death. Ashlea Aldridge's family knew in their heart that her former boyfriend had beaten her to death. There had been a long history of domestic violence in their relationship. Her sister Alyssa had been witness to this violence between her sister and her boyfriend throughout the years they were in a relationship. On more than one occasion, she and her family helped heal the wounds he left behind on Ashlea. There were times when he beat and tortured her so intensely that they would wipe the blood off of her entire body and clean up the splatters of blood on the walls. It was expressed by her sister how his family was not concerned at all about the abuse, and if anything, it was their family cycle of violence. But this horrific treatment of their daughter, their sister, would not be accepted, much less ignored, and the family did what they could to stop his abuse. On more than a dozen separate occasions, Ashlea Aldridge contacted the tribal police, pleading for their help. She told the law enforcement officers that her boyfriend severely abused her and that she was terrified of him. Yet nothing was ever done. The tribal police never followed up on her claims. They never confronted Ashlea's boyfriend about these allegations of abuse, and so it continued. Ashlea and her family did everything in their power to raise awareness of the issue and how Ashlea was a victim of domestic abuse. Not only did Ashlea contact the tribal police a dozen times or more regarding the violent abuse she was suffering at the hands of her boyfriend, but her mother wrote to Umonhon tribal leaders in 2017 asking for their help because she was terrified that her daughter was going to be seriously injured by this man or even killed. Sadly, her words did not trigger anything to change Ashlea's situation in time and help save the life of a petrified woman and mother. This pattern of abuse continued to escalate, and Ashlea finally attempted to be rid of him for good. Studies on intimate partner violence show that this is the period when a woman is the most vulnerable to becoming a victim of homicide. With this utter lack of concern and absence of any responsibility exhibited by the reservation police for Ashlea's well-being, it was only a matter of time before she would become another statistic of domestic homicide. Women face more domestic violence and are victims of homicide by their intimate partners now than at any other time in history. This is a virus that I have addressed before, and it is critical to reinforce the fact that domestic violence is a crisis that Indigenous women face at rates exponentially higher than non-Indigenous women do. Domestic violence has become rampant for Indigenous women, and this ongoing crisis is not prioritized by tribal leaders or the tribal police. The data is grossly underreported, including murders that result from patterns of domestic and intimate partner violence. There is a lack of understanding about the unique circumstances Indigenous women and girls are faced with on the reservations. They are isolated and not protected by law enforcement, and their cries for help have ultimately been ignored by tribal leaders who too often treat them as they are the ones to blame. These predators and abusers are not held accountable for the violence they inflict, and instead, the victims are painted as if they have done something to warrant the abuse. The great majority of victims of violence are being preyed upon by those who are non-Indigenous. It is estimated that as high as 96% of women and 89% of men reported being victimized by non-Indigenous offenders. This is astronomically high, but little, if anything, is ever done. Legislation that has been crafted by the non-Indigenous patriarchy and decisions upheld by the Supreme Court have failed to give tribal authorities any power to prosecute these violent offenders. This lack of authority tribal police and its leaders have over the crimes perpetrated by non-Indigenous offenders has led to an open raid of violence upon the reservations. It is the prime setting for a predator or violent offender to commit crimes because they know they can get away with it. The vast land on the reservations increases their isolation and makes them increasingly more vulnerable to becoming victimized. Offenders also know that most likely they will not be held accountable for any crime they commit there, since the tribal police do not have criminal jurisdiction over non-Indigenous individuals for any major crimes. Or at least this is what most tribal communities have been historically led to believe. Domination over Indigenous nations has its roots in the colonization of their lands by the European elite. During the 15th and 16th centuries, many believed in the doctrine of discovery, which empowered monarchs, kings, and queens to steal any land or property owned or lived upon by non-Christian people. It was their spiritual, political, and legal way to justify stealing the lands from Indigenous communities. This intrusion upon their lands has existed since the 1500s, and violence and conversion to Christianity was forced upon the tribes. Congress created the first act of federal jurisdiction within Indigenous lands in 1817. This gave the federal government the power to arrest, charge, and prosecute Indigenous people amongst the reservations who committed crimes against non-natives. Then the Major Crimes Act in 1885 followed suit, which gave the government the power to prosecute Indigenous people who committed certain crimes against the person or property owned by those on the reservation. These two acts essentially wiped out any legitimate power and jurisdiction held by the tribal police. And the current federal laws are still based upon this legislation. However, the colonial language used within these two acts led to gross misinterpretation, leaving Indigenous communities completely unprotected and powerless to hold those accountable on the reservation who committed sex crimes and other acts of violence against them. It was not until the 2005 Violence Against Women Act that this law would finally be clarified. The prior statutes permitted concurrent jurisdiction. Because of this obscure, biased language that was constructed within the voice of the patriarchy, Indigenous leaders and tribal police officers did not believe that they had any right to protect their women and girls from violence. This failure to communicate their rights has directly helped to perpetuate this epidemic of violence they now face. With 1 in 3 Indigenous women and girls being raped in their lifetime, the dire consequences of this lack of transparency within the laws are profoundly clear. In 2005, when the Violence Against Women Act was initially passed, tribal leaders used their voices to reinforce how the violence would not end unless they had full tribal sovereignty and the resources necessary to empower them with the authority to provide real protection for the girls and women. This continues to be reiterated by the communities and its leaders, but the government neglects to implement this so real change can take place. In 2022, President Biden signed the Violence Against Women Act, which expanded the powers of the special criminal jurisdiction of the tribal courts. This allows them to arrest, charge, and prosecute non-Indigenous offenders for sexual assault, child abuse, sex trafficking, stalking, and assaults made upon tribal police officers, if they are on reservation lands. Yet it still does not give them the jurisdiction necessary to prosecute murders, which stalls progress on the current crisis. These acts also describe the findings made on their overrepresentation of Indigenous females as homicide victims, the sexual violence they are inflicted with, in addition to the historical trauma an entire tribe suffers from. I have discussed historical trauma, also known as generational trauma, in an earlier episode, but it is critical to address how its far-reaching impact and effects on Indigenous communities should not be underestimated. This is a kind of trauma that can be experienced by those who have been exposed to extreme violence, genocide, cultural isolation, and degradation. It carries itself through the generations, and even those who were not directly involved in the trauma still feel the after effects of it. When European colonists settled in the Americas and stole the Indigenous people's land, they took much more than property. They murdered countless tribal leaders, and when they were killed, much of their sacred rituals, traditions, and stories went with them. The colonial patriarchy attempted to destroy and eradicate their ways of life, culture, and traditions. Their children were taken from them. They were shoved off the lands which were part of their spiritual connection to the earth. This degree of trauma that an entire nation of once free people experienced is unfathomable, and many struggle to heal from these wounds. These wounds can never heal when their people go missing, are abused, tortured, and murdered, and no one does a damn thing to prevent it. Most of the time, these stories and cases don't even make it to the media at all. When they do, the details are minimal and obscure at best, because the investigations into their disappearances and deaths are exactly that. They are neglected, even ignored. Prosecutors continue to show that they don't prioritize violence that is committed against Indigenous people, as very seldom do these perpetrators of sexual assault, domestic violence, trafficking, and murders ever face any punishment. For those who are prosecuted for murder, more often than not, their charges are dropped to second-degree, if not third-degree homicide, and they are sentenced less severely than perpetrators whose victims are non-Indigenous. Programs to help raise awareness, educational resources, and shelters to protect victims of domestic violence are not prioritized. There are issues of trust, fear, and conflicts of interest within the tribal communities themselves that further complicate the problem. At a listening session held by the city of Umonhon at Ponca tribal offices, some families expressed fear that if they inform police that their child did not come home, they may be vulnerable to child protective services, looking negatively on their family, and when the youth returns, they could be placed into the foster system. These worries reflect an inherent distrust of the criminal justice system and the foster care system. It would be almost irrational for them to not hold these concerns, considering how many Indigenous children were ripped away from their families living on reservations in the past, and some still are today. Recent research on the state of Nebraska foster care system revealed that Indigenous children are placed into the foster care system at a higher rate than non-Indigenous children are, and they are less likely to ever be reunited with their families. There is also the issue of what can only be deemed as conflicts of interest and matters of kinship within their tribal communities. The suspect of the crime may be related or friends with someone in the tribal police or one of the community leaders. It was also addressed in the session by Ponca Tribal Chairman Larry Wright Jr. how the challenges and disparities many tribal members face, such as generational poverty, little formal education, a wide range of health issues, both physical and mental, and high unemployment only add to this crisis. It was noted that Indigenous people are 4 times more likely than whites are to live below the poverty level, making their degree of vulnerability especially high. Many community members also raised the concern about the lack of communication between the tribal police and the FBI and the local and the state police, especially regarding cases of missing persons. The tense and negative relationship that law enforcement has with the members of the tribes also adds to this conflict, which does nothing to benefit those missing and their families. Specifically, it was expressed how law enforcement does not provide them with any updates on cases regarding their missing loved ones. This problem reaches far beyond the reservation, with many cases of the loved ones of missing persons not being kept up to date with information by law enforcement. Ashlea Aldridge has been quite vocal about how she and her family feel her sister's case was mishandled. She reported to local media that the FBI agent in charge was negligent and only cared about closing the case as quickly as possible. This is not the first and sadly not the last case of murder where law enforcement doesn't seem concerned about finding justice at all, but instead prioritizing the number of cases they close. In cases of homicide that are deemed to be suicides or accidents, there are countless examples where police officers were lazy, incompetent, or simply didn't care enough about the victim to pursue a legitimate and thorough investigation. For Indigenous people who are too often treated as if their lives are second to non-Indigenous citizens, these sloppy, unethical, and biased investigations are far too common. The contradictory evidence that Ashley's loved ones visibly saw versus what the FBI agent claimed raises all kinds of issues of integrity and competence. There was blatantly obvious evidence of an assault and a record of historical violence toward the victim. Unfortunately, the conclusion of accidental hypothermia as a cause of death is often the go-to answer for law enforcement, and there have been many. Ashley's death amongst them, whose mysterious deaths, which were most likely murders, barely investigated at all. In fact, in January 2020 alone, 3 missing and murdered Indigenous women were found deceased. Their deaths were all ruled in the same manner. Selena Not Afraid, a 16-year-old girl from the Crow Reservation in Montana, and 23-year-old Jade Wagon from the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming. Both went missing and were found murdered under ominous circumstances. Yet the FBI declared they both died from hypothermia. Does the FBI sincerely believe that Indigenous women wander off in the middle of the night alone, intoxicated or high, and sometimes without clothing on, pass out and freeze overnight? Do they actually believe that Indigenous people, or anyone for that matter, will accept this nonsense and not scream injustice at their complete lack of an investigation. This degree of incompetence, neglect, bias, and lack of empathy demonstrated in the investigation into anyone's death should not be legally permitted. FBI agents who handle cases in this manner should be held liable for unethical practices and procedures. No one in law enforcement should have the right or the power to treat investigations with such little concern and show such little compassion and respect to the loved ones of the victims in this way. It is disgusting and infuriating that they neglect to spend any time or resources on helping to locate the missing or solve the murders of Indigenous people. I understand that issues of criminal jurisdiction exist. This makes things much more difficult and can cause great amounts of conflict and tension between the different agencies involved, but this is ridiculous. Their lives are just as valuable as anyone else's, and there should be zero excuses for not handling every case accurately, respectfully, and with integrity, no matter who the victim is and no matter who may be the offender. As a result of the violent abuse Ashlea Aldridge suffered throughout her entire relationship, which was completely ignored by tribal leaders and law enforcement, which ultimately led to her murder, Ashlea's family have become strong advocates for domestic violence awareness and education. That same year she was murdered, Ashlea's niece, Donette Moniz Rayon, a member of the Winnebago Ho-Chunk tribe, made a promise after the funeral. She made an oath to her aunt that she would never be forgotten, that she would do everything she could to share her story and remember her name. Even though Donette had gone to the school superintendent with her plans and requested permission, to which he had given full support, within the same week school officials decided against her plan. But Donette refused to have her voice silenced. She led a moment of silence along with other Indigenous high school cheerleaders during a basketball game. Their mouths were painted with red handprints, which has become a symbol of the missing murdered Indigenous women and girls movement. It represents all of the stolen Indigenous sisters lost to this crisis and symbolizes the silence exhibited by both law enforcement and the media while it continues. It signifies the end of the subjugation and oppression of Indigenous women and girls, and how they will no longer be silenced. She brought out photographs of Ashlea Aldridge with her family. They then handed the pictures over to Ashlea's mother, who sat in the audience. It was reported that one of her sons held on to one of the pictures and cried out, "My mama, my mama." As you can imagine, there were few dry eyes in the auditorium. After their moment of silence was held, the very next day, their cheer squad was banned for the remainder of the season. When asked as to why, it was reported that they had violated their contract by drinking and eating on the courtside and that they didn't cheer during game timeouts. Donette saw through their explanation, though, and she immediately went to her social media accounts to call out the school and the superintendent. She wrote how the only reason they were banned from cheering the remainder of the season was because of what they had done to raise awareness of the missing and murdered Indigenous women girls movement and the crisis of domestic violence Indigenous females face. Donette Moniz Rayon has become a very strong voice in the movement and has become a very positive, strong role for young Indigenous women. She is a model, an advocate, a filmmaker, and I can only imagine the amazing things she will do as the years go on. Ashlea Aldridge's family and the community will not let her be forgotten, and they want people to know who she was. Ashlea's passion with makeup, and after graduating from high school, she earned her certification in cosmetology. Her greatest happiness in life, though, was raising her two young sons. Her family members described how easygoing and fun she was. that she was full of love and forgiveness. On the 4th anniversary of Ashlea's body being discovered, members of the tribe and others throughout Macy, Nebraska, united to remember her. They walked over the bridge together where Ashlea's body had been found. Ashlea's parents, Galen and Tilly, refused to give up on justice for their daughter, hoping they can unearth some evidence one day that proves to the contrary what the FBI believes and the autopsy declared. Tilly Aldridge asked that people say Ashlea's name, share her story, and to not allow her daughter to become a forgotten victim. In her words, Tilly Aldridge said, and I quote, "We are the people, and we have a voice. We have to use it, and we have to stand together, not only to get justice for Ashlea, but anybody and everybody that has been done wrong, treated unfairly, has lost loved ones, has questions, and that need answers." Thank you so much for listening to this heartbreaking and very important story about Ashlea Aldridge of Umonhon tribe in Nebraska. I appreciate each and every one of you, and I am beyond thrilled to be your host. Thank you so much for taking this journey with me. I have many new exciting developments coming soon in the next couple weeks and months, and I look forward to sharing them all with you. Until next time, be safe. And watch out for shades of murder happening in the streets next door. And especially inside your own home. Shades of Murder is created, written, and edited by Alita Caldwell. Music courtesy Pixabay by Ashlea Aldridge.